Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and The Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Victor, who is an intermediate photographer from Indiana. Victor shot this with an Olympus digital compact camera, 38 380 millimeter built-in lens. So essentially, the effective focal length here is a pretty long telephoto. Victor shot this at ISO 100. Aperture was f8. Great aperture on most lenses in terms of sharpness, and 1/100th of a second, which makes me think that Victor may have been on a tripod here because this looks pretty sharp. Be curious to hear from Victor about that. And the ISO was 100. White balance was cloudy. That's really interesting to me in the context of Victor's backstory. He says this is the silhouette of his friend. His friend's taking pictures, and he backed up and he got this shot of his friend standing in early morning fog alongside a river. This is in India. And Victor said he was going for this look of the golden feeling of the light in the early morning coming through the fog. And so shooting this shot on cloudy, where the sun and the color temperature of the sun, as the cool short waves of light get filtered out by all this atmosphere, the sun is already going to read very warm here. Going to cloudy has pushed that even more. So good choice if you wanted to go for the idea of a golden sunrise. And Victor has some really interesting questions with his submission. One of his questions is, would it have been better if I cropped the tree out of the image on the far left? Another question has to do with his background. He's submitted the image, a very panoramic image. He submitted it with this colored background. He said he did that because the sun behind the fog up here blew out, and he wanted this to separate from the edge. So you can imagine if there's a white background here, we matted this as a print with white matte. This may bleed into this, so Victor has chosen this color to keep that from happening. And he says, number one, what do I think about the color presentation on the border, and also would I just crop this out to get around that issue? And then Victor has a question about LCD monitors, and we'll just talk about that at the very end. Great questions. As far as the tree goes in this image, I would leave it. For me, the experience of looking at this image is going straight to the drama of the silhouette. You know, this is the highest contrast part of the image. That has a lot of visual weight. Archetypes can be very, very visually powerful, and there's not one that's much more powerful than the archetype of a human form. And if we start to silhouette that, it really starts to take on a lot of weight. The way I look at this image is I find the silhouette of Victor's friend almost immediately. I look and see maybe he has binoculars, maybe a camera. He's definitely looks like he's looking in this direction. So the tree to me gives an element of story to this that starts to tie it together. It's also what I would call a visual stop. There's so much potential movement with Victor's friend standing here, particularly in a bigger print where you really can sort of see his orientation very, very clearly. So much potential movement going in this direction with not anything to really slow the eye down, that without this, I could see the eye zooming out of the frame, and this just becoming kind of a one-note thing where you look and see the silhouette, and you don't see much else in terms of story, and you go away. So no, I can't imagine cropping this out. I think it adds another layer of story, and I think it keeps the mind's eye with the picture longer. Let's talk about the border part of this. Yes, a darker border or a colored border will create separation here. But the thing that you have to consider when you start to add a color around a photograph, if you're doing it to correct one problem, is it may start to create other problems. One of the things that happens with this yellow border is that it starts to affect the visual weight of the dark value silhouettes of the grasses at the bottom of the image that's a base for Victor's friend. And because it lessens that, then the eye doesn't get as much of a chance to enjoy those ideas, so we don't slow down as much along these beautiful textures that are happening in the bottom part of the image. And I'll show you what I'm talking about, and you can sort of decide for yourself if that's how you see it. If I go to a white border all the way around and you look in the bottom part of the image, for me, particularly down in here where you start to have some really beautiful filigree and exciting quality of line, this really starts to slow me down and bring me back around into the image. I start to spend more time in the lower part of the image, and I'll go back again to the colored border. And so, yes, that colored border may keep this kind of bleeding out into the matte or out into the white background from happening, but to tell you the truth, that doesn't bother me nearly as much as basically losing the power of a lot of the detail in the bottom part of the image. The silhouette of Victor's friend is so strong that you still go to that, but even some of this other information down in here, like this beautiful feeling of the tree in the middle in the fog and some of this detail, it really starts to get wiped away by the harmony of that color that's appearing around the subject. And one of my big mentors and one of my teaching heroes and photographic heroes, Neil Chaput, who founded the Rocky Mountain School of Photography. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for Neil. Hands down, it's one of the two most important people in my life. And Neil was such a stickler for traditional presentation of photographs, a white mat with a neutral colored frame, museum framing. The photograph stands for itself, and you could say, well, that's personal taste, but one thing that's true about that approach is it's a simple approach where you don't run into these issues of the color that you choose to go around potentially becoming such a powerful part of design that it ends up really taking away from the message that you're sending. And I was affected by Neil. I'm also in some ways very non-traditional, but when it comes to presentation, because of Neil's influence on me, and I just think the value that I place on what's inside of the frame and how much I want to enjoy that, I really like for the framing device to be something that's very neutral, and in fact a white background is my favorite background. I wouldn't crop this down from the top, and one of the reasons that I wouldn't crop it from the top is that even though you may have this bleed out on a bright colored background, I really think that this breakup of this negative space up here adds a lot to the image. Without it, this really starts to become a one-note image in terms of visual movement. It's all about the x-axis. And when we bring in this beautiful shape and the suggestion of the sun up here, it starts to create movement on the y-axis. I can start to move up and down, maybe not straight up and down, maybe some really nice movement on the diagonal that happens like this, and also even the z-axis. I can start to think about some depth in the top part of the image. One of the things that I'll say here is that one of the things that Victor mentioned going for was a sense of scale. And what's interesting is that a lot of times, because of the inherent visual weight of the top part of the frame and the idea of gravity and mass pushing down, that when we want to show scale by putting a small figure in a big expanse, a lot of times having more room or more of a sense of scale on the y-axis can do a better job of suggesting a lot of space than we can ever get the feeling of just a lot of movement on the x-axis by itself. Just something to think about. And this is another one of these images where you could sit here and really look at the power of flipping this image and how that might have an effect on you, just because of how important the weight of moving from left to right and versus right to left, and how we feel about that and the ease of doing it. And also with that bright spot in the top right, just the different movement along the diagonal. It's easier to move from top left to bottom right, so that creates one kind of weight if it's oriented this way. Not as easy to move from bottom left to top right. That creates another kind of feeling. And the interesting thing is the border is also having an effect. If we flip this with the white background versus the colored background, that adds another element of weight into the mix, and that's why I tend to stay away from the colored backgrounds. Tend to complicate things. Great submission by Victor, and I love it when people make submissions with questions. A couple of final things I'll say about this. Really cool image in terms of scale and in terms of beautiful movement on the x-axis. Is a beautiful panoramic. I'd love to see a little bit more layer of story here. To me, this is almost like the beginning of a story, and then something comes in from the left. It makes me think of Lawrence of Arabia or something, these big wide shots and figures moving in and out. And I almost feel like this would work better as a series of shots where this is setting the stage and the person is looking, and then something comes in from the left, and then it moves in a little bit closer, and so on and so forth. This to me sort sort of sets the stage. I'm always thinking about layers of story in a still photograph, and a lot of times I do like to think of at least three things where the viewer can move around spatially or in the context of time or colors to different places. And here it's a little bit of a two-note back and forth kind of thing, just something to think about. It's still a really stunning landscape photograph. Great job of adding the human figure to give this some scale and make it exciting. Big thank you to Victor for a great submission. Hope to see you again very, very soon on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.